The MENA Talks, a podcast series by the BIC on the Middle East and North Africa. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will explore underlying historical, economic, social and political drivers behind today's systemic issues in the MENA region. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to this episode of the MENA Talks. My name is Ben Lowings. I'm a political analyst at the Brussels International Centre. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Alanna O'Malley, who is chair of the United Nations Studies in Peace and Justice at Leiden University and the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Today we'll be talking about the United Nations. So in September earlier this year, the 76th UN General Assembly met in New York. Several global challenges are dominating the debates around the world. Conflict and violence has persisted. Afghanistan, Syria, Ethiopia, Myanmar, to name but a few, are continuing to shock the world. Global health is a central issue with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and especially vaccine rollouts across developing nations. And meanwhile, other challenges like climate change and its effects on populations have been major talking points. At the General Assembly, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that it's our time to reignite multilateralism and restore trust. He identified what he termed 6 great divides facing the world: achieving peace, climate change, the global vaccine plan for COVID-19, gender inequality, which he called the world's most enduring injustice, digital technology issues, such as the protection of personal data, and finally, the generation gap, that is, young inheriting the problems of today's world. On this, he appointed a special envoy for future generations and a UN Youth Office as a seat at the table for young people. So let's start here. What can we take away from this general debate, Alanna? And what can we learn from these topics that have been introduced by the Secretary General?
So thanks very much for having me and for giving me an opportunity to analyse, if you like, what's taken place at the UN. It's been a very busy and dynamic period, as you've outlined with all those initiatives in the last couple of weeks. I think it's very, the Secretary General issued the long-awaited report, Our Common Agenda, on the eve of the beginning of the General Assembly session. And indeed, it included a lot of these initiatives around climate change, around the role of youth, but also about really putting meat on the bones of that phrase, reinvigorated multilateralism. And by which he means, he talked about, renewing the social contract between the UN and the global public. But he also talked about very substantial things like repurposing the Trusteeship Council, which has lain empty, if you like, for quite a while now, and indeed the creation of new initiatives and new structures and new committees within the UN, particularly that special envoy for future generations. And he also talked about having a summit of the future to really try to invigorate this kind of sense of multilateralism. And if you like, this really, I think, was intended to offer a blueprint or a roadmap for a lot of the discussions that have gone on at the state level about the importance of regenerated multilateralism, of strengthened multilateralism, of strengthening the rules-based world order. So I think really this is quite a welcome initiative from the Secretary General, but it really depends now how he actually implicates and really, if you like, implements a lot of these initiatives. I think it's to take one issue that he raised that I think is an interesting one. He raised the question of gender equity. We've known for a long time that gender equity around the world is a huge problem. Last year was the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security resolution from the Security Council, and we still obviously don't have gender equity anywhere. But it's also worth pointing out, of course, that we still don't also have gender parity within the UN. So it will be interesting to see, the General Assembly week is always a time for big proclamations and declarations and, if you like, very highfalutin rhetoric. But what happens next is actually more important. So will the Secretary General, for instance, on that issue, promise and really deliver on gender parity even within the UN system? Will the UN practice what it preaches on some of these issues? And that remains to be the question. And the report does make promises about gender equity by, I think, 2028, which is quite soon. So we hope that he really puts the initiative into action now. And I think the other thing to kind of bear in mind about Guterres and these declarations is that he's in his second term now. So he's not really thinking at all about another election, I guess. And now he really has the chance, if you like, to really be more activist. And I think there was a great feeling of disappointment with his performance in the last few years. He has been regarded as being rather on the sidelines of a lot of international crises and events rather than in the center of the action. And I think now he has an opportunity to be a more activist Secretary General and to really, if you like, use for, maximize the potential of his second term. And I think that this report is a good beginning, because some of the initiatives he will rely on states and regional organizations and non-state actors to really take up. But some of them he can implement himself within the UN system through the Secretariat. So it's very well designed in that way. He's really taking two dimensions of multilateralism and hoping that they come together. But, he's not reliant on waiting for states to respond to this on everything. So that's, I think that's a good sign. But I'm really waiting now for him to start doing it. So now the time for talking has passed. The General Assembly week is over, General Assembly month, some people call it. And now we have to see what he will actually do.
So let's start here then. So with Mr. Guterres, as you said, he's in his second election term. One of the big pledges that he said he wanted to do was work towards ensuring the blossoming of trust between and among nations. However, a lot of observers, notably Human Rights Watch, have said that Mr. Guterres rarely publicly criticizes, denounces, or calls for accountability of any specific government for things such as human rights abuses. So what can he and what should he do as Secretary General more than he has done in the past?
Yeah, so he had this quite unusual role, if you like, in the first term of his Secretary Generalship, in that, he was Secretary General at a time that the United States really stepped back from a lot of their leadership positions on those traditional human rights questions. And it wasn't just at the Security Council, but they also stepped back in UN agencies and organizations. In fact, they cut funding for a lot of those UN agencies and organizations. And you have to remember that, openly criticizing countries and states and state actors for the human rights record is just one part of addressing human rights concerns. And it's an important part, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other part is actually the work that the UN does through its agencies, through the Human Rights Council, of course, to try to alleviate those abuses and to try to monitor what's going on, to ask for reports, to send in observers. And all of that work, the actual on the ground negotiation, the kind of physical part, the if you like, of human rights protection really relies on quiet diplomacy, relies on good relationships. It relies on sometimes talking to people that you don't want to talk to, and it really relies on carefully managed diplomacy. So I think Guterres in his first term, without having the reliance of the United States and without their leadership on this question, took the other road, and he engaged in quiet diplomacy on a lot of these levels. Quiet diplomacy is a kind of a slow burner. It doesn't work very quickly. And the problem with that was that these human rights abuses were perpetrated, particularly you're thinking about the Uyghur people in China, what was going on in Myanmar, what's happened now in Ethiopia, but also what's happening in many other places, in Libya, of course, in Mali. And so there is a litany of human rights abuses that Human Rights Watch are paying attention to. I haven't even mentioned the Middle East. Of course, there's myriad human rights abuses there. So I think what he tried to do in the first term was to let those agencies do their job without agitating relations by making huge criticisms and public declarations. But the problem, of course, is that the UN Secretary Generalship is also a public voice, it's a public platform. And the person who holds that position, the individual, the office, is also supposed to be a voice that will continually reiterate the importance of protecting human rights, regardless of the damage that might do politically to relationships. And so on that level, I can understand the frustration with him. He was seen to be very tame in the face of human rights abuses perpetrated, not just by China and Russia on the security, big powers on the Security Council, but also by other powers in the Middle East. The whole Khashoggi question that was going on in Saudi Arabia, what was happening in Syria in the Assad regime, what's happening in Egypt. The recent case of Giulia Regni really kind of illustrates very well the human rights abuses that are perpetrated in that system. And these are countries, of course, that need to be called out on their human rights record. And I think there was understandable disappointment with him for not doing that in his first term. I think the difference now is that, firstly, you're dealing with a different United States, and Biden, and we'll probably get back to this later, has talked about the importance of a rules-based world order. So we have to see what he really means by that. So we can expect a greater public conversation about human rights, I hope, in Guterres' second term. But he can do more, right? So it's not unprecedented for the Secretary General to bring human rights abuses to the Security Council under Article 99 of the Charter. He can do that more. He can use his personal influence with these states and also non-state actors who are perpetrating these abuses. And he can also put pressure on multilateral allies and regional organizations to play a stronger role in addressing these abuses. And this doesn't just go for actors who are in far-flung places. I mean, what's happening in the Ukraine now, we will learn, I think, much more about the human rights abuses there in the next months and certainly years. The EU could play a stronger role there. And so that would really put a lot of grit behind French and German declarations and Dutch declarations of the importance of multilateralism. If Guterres can encourage them to use the EU's soft power more strongly and hard power, if necessary, to deal with the human rights abuses that are going on in the east of the continent. So this is a widespread problem, and he really needs to do more.
So on the Security Council, let's have a moment to have a look into this. The president of the 76th session was Abdullah Shahid, and he said that reform of the UN Security Council is a membership-driven issue. I mean, this is nothing new. There's been a lot of talk for years about how reform of the membership is part of the issue that the Security Council has in terms of being efficient and addressing problems. We see delays, vetoes, reformulations of texts to dampen down the language and get specific actors. So what can we make of the UN Security Council and its role in 2021, especially in this context of, let's say, a more overt tensions between some of the permanent members, such as the US, China, and Russia?
Yeah. I mean, the relationships between the great powers are always tendentious, but they're at the moment very, very strained, especially between the three that you've mentioned, and perhaps not exactly great between France and Britain either, given the whole history of the Brexit fallout and the strain that has put on inter-EU relations in the last 5 years. So I would actually, there is a long conversation and a long history of the importance of membership-driven reform, as you have described it, and of getting this whole question of the veto, devising a solution for that. But I actually think the more interesting conversations about reform take place around initiatives driven by non-permanent members. And I'm thinking of the French-Mexican proposal a few years ago. I'm thinking of the area formulation. I'm thinking of the ways in which the Security Council has given recourse to the General Assembly for issues that they're deadlocked on. We've seen that happening more and more. The General Assembly, of course, is a much more representative arena. Difficult to get agreement because of the 193 members there, but it's definitely worthy of putting difficult questions into that arena because of the nature of public discussion there. Now, the other thing that I think is really important about reform is, as I mentioned, the role of non-permanent members. And it's worth bearing in mind that these members negotiate agenda items for others who are not represented on the Security Council. So you have 10 non-permanent members, and they rotate every couple of years. At the moment, Ireland is a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and crucially, they held the presidency of the Security Council last month. So that was a very important moment for their role. And one of the things that they wanted to do, they negotiated, of course, the agenda for this with not just the other Security Council members, but again, members who are not on the Security Council right now. So non-permanent members, they're an avenue for other member states to try to persuade their item to be on the Security Council agenda. And there's a lot of scope for initiative in designing that agenda, because non-permanent members aren't there all the time and they don't have a veto. So they tend to be, quite expansive about the agenda items. One of the things that Ireland did was they organised a parallel debate on the Security Council during General Assembly Week on the security implications of climate change. And that, of course, was very much welcomed by countries in the Global South especially, but also, of course, many others who wanted to discuss the severe and immediate implications of climate change. So not climate change as a kind of long-term process that requires action, but climate change as in causing threats to international peace and security. So they organized that parallel debate, and I think that was a very useful exercise. So I would actually like to see reform in terms of, thinking more expansively about the role of the non-permanent members, perhaps enabling them to do a little bit more. And again, encouraging the Secretary General to look into the Charter to expand the authority of his office to help the Security Council to function more effectively. And in that way, you can have procedural reform, which is in fact the direction that most reform has gone in. It is membership driven, but it tends to be procedural rather than political. And I think that this is really the avenue for reform. And if you see the way that non-permanent actors have performed, not just Ireland, the Netherlands had a term on the Security Council a couple of years ago. They did a lot with that as well. Then that's the way they're looking at it. They're already thinking about procedural and structural reform in their role. So we just need to formalize that, actually.
It's interesting you talk about these things such as initiatives to, let's say, tackle certain problems such as climate change, because a lot of these are more general, wider reaching problems in the world. But then, of course, the Security Council has to respond to specific events in the world, specific outbreaks of violence, specific conflicts. And often, as we know, it uses the strongest thing it can do is do resolutions. Now, the most recent Security Council resolutions have been about Afghanistan and Libya, mainly. The Libyan resolutions have been extensions of the mandate for the mission in Libya. Not much else there, honestly, other than that. But the ones for Afghanistan are very interesting because following all the events that we saw in August, they expressed condemnation solely for Islamic State Khorasan. There is very little mention of the Taliban at all anymore. So we can see even in the language here that there's this interesting selection of who we can and can't blame. So what do you think about this and in Afghanistan in particular, perhaps this response? How does this show the issues that maybe the Security Council has in responding to conflict?
This is the question that I think fascinates me about the UN so much, and I think it has generated so much conversation and scholarship indeed in the last 76 years of the UN's history. It's the selectivity bias of the UN, not just in what issues get to the UN and get to be discussed, but also which actors become legitimized and then others delegitimized. And I think you see that so clearly in what's going on in Afghanistan. Taliban were kind of persona non grata for a long time, and all of a sudden they are accepted as the legitimate representatives of the Afghan people. Now, I think there's three main reasons for that. Firstly, obviously, what took place in August with the collapse of the Afghan government, the Taliban taking over, and the kind of frankly horrendous scenes of the American withdrawal and the really the chaos that caused, has led the United States in particular to seek to encourage other member states to generate a friendly relationship towards the Taliban government. And you see the Qataris playing a very important role in that. And the Qatari foreign minister has made many statements on the importance of maintaining relationships with the Taliban government in order that it doesn't become a pariah state. And that's, that is to the benefit in some ways of the Afghan people, that the international community continues to engage with Afghanistan. But it does cause problems because, of course, the Taliban were the object of UN policies for a long time. And now they're kind of UN actors, if you like, almost. So I think there's a lot of politics around the pressure to recognize the Taliban as legitimate representatives and to take them on board as, the state's men and women of the Afghan people right now. Now, the other two elements that really kind of play into that process are, firstly, there is the security concern around Afghanistan, not so much only internally. I think there's a great concern about what kind of Afghanistan the Taliban will create. Will it be the same kind of oppressive regime as they had in the 1990s? Or will it be, will their promises of a more equitable society actually be delivered? I think that there is a lot of doubt about that, but I think that there's a lot of concern about how the Afghan people will be treated by the Taliban government. But there's also the kind of wider international domestic question. Afghanistan is still a strategically important location for international security. You have the whole question of ISIS-K indeed, but also many other insurgent groups in the region. So what I think a lot of neighboring countries and a lot of other countries don't want is Afghanistan to turn into a pariah state that harbors international terrorist regimes. And thinking about the close relationship of Russia and of the US to the Afghanistan borders, then that's a real issue. Now, the other two issues that arise in Afghanistan are, firstly, there is an impending famine. There's an impending crisis related to food supply and related to people's ability to just survive. And that humanitarian concern has drawn in the UN very directly. I mean, Guterres has made repeated statements on this even in the last week about the importance of supporting the Afghan people, and regardless of the Taliban political recognition question. That's going to become a growing problem, I think, in the coming months as we face into the winter. And there's going to be a lot of pressure about who supplies the humanitarian food. Is it the World Food Programme? Is it the UN? Is it international donors and other guises? Can they operate freely there? Will this food be distributed fairly? And if not, will there be a destabilizing crisis caused by hunger and famine, which always happens? So there are security implications related to that impending humanitarian catastrophe. The third element, and this is the one that we've seen really make the headlines in the last few weeks, is the whole question of the freezing of Afghan funds around the world. So the Taliban have, called for the unfreezing of their assets, which are held in foreign banks and foreign financial systems, so that they can run the government. And we know that the United States has frozen billions of dollars of aid to Afghanistan, but not just aid, also assets of the Afghan state. And that's going to be a very tricky question, because as long as that it remains frozen, it's an incentive for the Taliban regime to maintain good relationships with the organizations and states that control those financial systems. But once the funds are released, then that incentive is really gone. So it really depends. I think, there's a lot of, it's really kind of a game of two halves. We're waiting for the Taliban to deliver on some of their promises of political, social, and economic freedom for their people. But at the same time, we have to think about the fact that as long as all of those funds remain frozen, then the impending humanitarian catastrophe just gets closer and becomes worse. So it's a real balance of interest in the region right now. And I think probably there's quite intense negotiations going on at an international level within the UN, but also within other organizations to try to think about short-term solutions.
So I'm going to touch upon an important actor who we've mentioned numerous times today, but especially in the context of Afghanistan, which is the United States. And of course, President Joe Biden had his first speech at the General Assembly, which was a highlight for many people actually watching the debates. They wanted to follow what he had to say, especially in regards to his predecessor, President Trump. And one of the things Mr. Biden said was leaving Afghanistan was a new era of relentless diplomacy. He spoke about a pride actually that the US is no longer at war. He said that the US can stand up to international bullies through its values and strength without mentioning those international bullies by name or who he's referring to. So my question is this, is this truly a new era of multilateralism, a new era of peace and security, or is it one in which the imposition of power goes unchecked around the world with the withdrawal, for example, of the United States? And further, what can the United Nations do with this type of context that the world is in at the moment?
Firstly, I disagree with you, and I actually think the best speech at the General Assembly came from the Prime Minister of Barbados, and she gave that in a very impassioned speech about the impact of climate change in small countries and how the great powers didn't pay any attention to this. And I think that was the best speech in the General Assembly. And you always have those unexpected speeches that are really touching on the issues in a very concrete way. So I think in comparison, Biden's speech was quite boring. But of course, it was the one that everybody was waiting for because it's his first speech as president of the US. He talked a lot about rules-based world order, and a lot of people interpreted that to mean the ways in which the US and China have been in competition for leadership of international organizations and kind of global leadership in general. During the Trump administration, China really expanded and deepened its global leadership in international organizations, especially at the UN. So China is now a top 5 contributor of troops for UN peacekeeping missions. And they have really done a lot to expand their role within the UN in various departments and agencies and within the UN system in general. And I think what Biden is referring to then about multilateralism is the sense that the United States wants to rebuild relationships with Europe, wants to rebuild relationships with traditional allies, and wants to strengthen the US role in the world that took a bit of a battering for the last 5 years. The question, though, is what kind of leadership will that be? And so far, I think just yesterday, Biden promised millions of vaccines to be donated to the global south. That was one kind of resounding battle cry that came from repeated General Assembly speeches. The whole question of vaccine politics and the global inequity that reflects, and the fact that this is a global pandemic. Each state is basically equally affected, and the supply of vaccines to global south countries hasn't been great, really, by the West in general and by the US. They've had a very poor record. The US and Britain have really donated the least, actually, of a lot of major powers. So Biden has kind of very recently come out and said he's going to donate more. And that's good to alleviate that problem. And so there are some kind of, like, I suppose, positive signs then that he really means to provide inclusive global leadership that really is multilateralist. It's not just US supremacy. I think the US withdrawal from Afghanistan also reflects that. They didn't try and dig in and stay in the Middle East as a major kind of linchpin position for American foreign policy. I think we will have to kind of see how American foreign policy develops. Anthony Blinken has basically been on the road since he got the job of Secretary of State. We've seen him pop up in a host of different places, massaging relationships, renewing old alliances, and basically trying to generate goodwill amongst the traditional allies. But I think it's not just about China. It's really also about Russia. And so the US and China will rebuild their relationships and the damage done to their trade relationship in particular. I think that will be rebuilt in the next couple of years. But Russia is different, and that's a relationship that's very contentious. And I think it's really exacerbated greatly under Trump, but there's no signs of really any waning or warming, if you like, between those two powers. And Putin is increasingly authoritarian. He's increasingly extremely non-interventionist when it comes to Russia's role in the world, except in their own sphere of influence. He's, he really, I think the relationship between the US and Russia is actually the one that's really going to be more difficult in the next couple of years. And I think the whole emphasis on American multilateralism is because Biden knows that, and he wants to generate greater, a stronger kind of block of support, if you like, for the future contestation of power with Russia. And it's different. I find that kind of whole idea of like a bipolar world order to be very non-reflective of reality, because Russia has a very, very different worldview than the United States. And so they have different interests in different parts of the world, of course, but also they have a different idea about what global leadership means. And for Russia, that's non-interventionist. That's state sovereignty is sacrosanct. And for the United States, it's, we have a responsibility. It's responsibility to protect. It's this idea of protecting human rights and those liberal internationalist values that oftentimes are not very liberal when they're really implemented in certain regimes. So it's that ideological competition, I think, that part is going to be where the contestation of rules-based world order is in the next few years. And saying that, I think it's very important to also remember that we can't think about the world only in terms of the relationships between the Security Council permanent members. It's far more interesting to think about the dynamism of what's going on between global South countries. And there is really, I think, where we'll see the most regenerated multilateralism. They have very strong institutions. I mean, if you look at the African Union, it's incredibly strong politically, strong regional organization. It's very, very good at resolving regional conflicts, at kind of helping to solidify relationships when there is a problem. And so I think really it's global South dynamism that will be, for me, much more interesting in terms of the evolution of the rules-based world order in the next couple of years.
As a final question, and this is to return a little bit back to the UN itself, this was how we started, right? You mentioned the African Union, and I guess then the European Union also falls into this as well. With these emerging, let's say, more regional organizations that are having an increasingly strong role in, as you say, resolving conflicts, discussing trade, discussing responses to energy, to climate, all of these different things. Is the UN as relevant in 2021 as it was a few years ago? Is it losing its place in the world? Does it still have a place in the world? Is reform more a case of, federalizing international relations, if that makes sense? What do you make of that?
My students ask me this all the time, who do we really need the UN? I mean, we have these powerful states, and I mean, we have global integration, we have these international systems. It's a hyper-connected world. And what I always say to them is that the UN has one thing that doesn't exist anywhere else, which is that it is the only forum in whatever particular organ you look at, in which all 193 member states have representation, and a couple of outliers who of course are just observers. But it is the only place in the world where all of these member states can come together, and that provides a focal point for non-state actors to come and to advocate for their causes. So it gives opportunity to people for whom their nation state does not, for whom their state power does not represent their interests. It gives them a forum to try to advocate for their causes. And I'm thinking of groups who are living under dictatorial regimes, who suffer human rights abuses. So firstly, it plays that role. It'll always play that role. And that is more than just a talking shop, because what the UN does is it provides overview And it provides the only existing check on state power of any institution in the world. And that check isn't very strong. And we rely on member states to report what's happening. We have human rights observers, of course, but nonetheless, those checks and balances are essential. That oversight capacity of the UN is irreplaceable. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that the recent global pandemic has shown us that, the pandemic, climate change, most questions of international peace and security, they cannot be solved on a state level. And actually, the role of the state actually has reduced in efficacy and in power in the last 20 years, certainly 25 years. So we need a global organization, and probably global organizations, to provide a way to coordinate responses to global challenges, because one state can't just solve these questions on their own. So I think the pandemic showed us that very, very clearly. This is not about one country's response. This is really about a global coordinated response. And what we see also with climate change is exactly the same thing. So I would actually disagree with you again, and I would say that even recent events have shown us that the UN's role is more relevant now than it was even, 5-6 years ago. But I think the UN's problem is that it's not very well understood what it really does amongst ordinary citizens, and that's a perception problem. And also, I think the UN's problem is that it needs to increase its immediacy to people. And again, I think the recent events have shown that, but I think it can do more in that regard, not just the UN itself, but also the ways in which states interact with the UN, the way in which citizens engage with the UN. I think all of those avenues provide a possibility for new reflections of what the organization can be, not just what it has been for 76 years.
Well, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Alanna, for joining me today. It was a very interesting discussion on all these issues. And I agree with you. I feel the UN, there needs to be a bit more to explain actually what the UN does for ordinary people and even organizations working in our field, in our sector. Sometimes it's a bit opaque what's actually happening, and maybe more can be done there. But either way, thank you so much for joining me today. And to all of our listeners out there, please join us again for another episode of the MENA Talks very soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks, and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and North Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.